Robotics Notes is a love letter to robot and mecha anime, and of all the SciADV subseries, Robotics Notes might just have the greatest number of sources of inspiration. From Hollywood movies like The Right Stuff, to shonen manga like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, to tokusatsu franchises like Ultraman, to Japanese mecha series like Gundam, Gunbuster, and Neon Genesis Evangelion, to even the robot anime that started them all, Astro Boy. There's a line from Phase 1 wherein Akiho describes the in-series Gunbarrel anime as being the culmination of all robot and mecha anime predating it, with Gunbarrel cherry-picking different elements from all its predecessors. Robotics Notes itself is very much the same, taking in so many different elements from dozens of robot and mecha series. Yet despite Robotics Notes very obviously being a love letter to the genre, most existing Robotics Notes analysis doesn't touch much upon its engagement with all its sources of inspiration. And I suppose this is likely because the average person that goes through SciADV is typically not a huge mecha nerd, myself included. Personally, I'm nowhere near comfortable enough to talk extensively about most of Robotics Notes' sources of inspiration, at least to the level I'm comfortable talking about SciADV. But there is one exception, that being none other than Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy, aka Tetsuwan Atomu, which is arguably the most influential anime and manga of all time. In this video, I go over where Robotics Notes pays homage to Astro Boy, most notably in Phase 6. And it should go without saying that the remainder of this video will contain spoilers for both Robotics Notes Elite and Astro Boy itself. Anyhow, at even just a preliminary glance, it should be extremely obvious that Astro Boy is a massive source of inspiration for Robotics Notes. Even at the beginning of the story, Akiho credits the start of this mass appeal and love for robots having emerged from what's in-universe known as Astro Kid, which is very obviously the in-story equivalent of Astro Boy. And throughout the rest of the story, we have several plot points based off of those seen in Astro Boy. Astro Boy has a number of different stories centering around the use of the sun to destroy the Earth, though the most iconic and memorable of these is undoubtedly in the final episode of the 1963 Astro Boy anime, The Greatest Adventure on Earth. In this episode, Napolitan's forces plot to take control of the Earth while a sunspot causes the planet to heat up like crazy. As a result, humanity forsakes the Earth, leaving on rockets to wander outer space for an entire year. In order to stop the sun from destroying the Earth, Adam flies on a rocket straight into the sun to return it back to normal and save the planet. In Robotics Notes, Project Adam is fundamentally about replicating the same general circumstances as the final episode of Astro Boy, artificially creating a solar corona to cause a massive magnetic solar storm to wreak havoc on the planet. All the while, the wealthiest of people would hide underground or go into space, the latter of which is rather reminiscent of what happens in Astro Boy. The fact that Project Adam is called what it is should make it pretty clear that this plan is a reference to Astro Boy, or Tetsuwan Atomu, as it's known in Japanese. Kimijima being Project Adam's mastermind is also quite fitting, in that he's somewhat similar to Napolitan in the sense that they are both artificial beings, seemingly derived from a real human brain, though in Napolitan's case, he mistakenly believes himself to be a cyborg with a human brain when he's actually 100% robot. But additionally, if you take one quick glance at the final episode of Gunbarrel, you immediately realize that it is basically the inverse of The Greatest Adventure on Earth. The Earth itself is in practically identical circumstances, with the solar storm threatening to eradicate humanity, leaving nothing but robots remaining. But in Astro Boy, Adam flies into the sun and sacrifices himself to stop it from destroying the Earth. Whereas in the final episode of Gunbarrel, all the robots basically cause the destruction of almost all organic life on the planet by committing mass suicide and jumping into a furnace powering a massive laser that makes the sun explode. So very obviously, both Project Adam and the final episode of Gunbarrel are largely inspired by Astro Boy. But in addition to narrative similarities between the two, there's some genuine thematic similarities as well, most prominently in Phase 6. A recurring line from all throughout Astro Boy is robots were created to be friends with humans. This line would come to fundamentally define Astro Boy for what it was, a work of extraordinary humanism, the belief that all lives are sacred and that all people are equal. At its core, it's a story of universal love and pacifism. It's a story that stood firmly against racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and warfare of all forms. Even though Robotics Notes and SciADV at large would never come to have these sorts of anti-racist or anti-war themes, this line itself would still come into play in Robotics Notes Phase 6 with a far more literal meaning, centering around the value that artificial existences like robots can hold for people. Robotics Notes Phase 6 is Juna's chapter, a character study on both Juna and Fujita. It's the story of a girl whose childhood traumas made her terrified of anything to do with robots, and also the story of her grandfather, who himself became disillusioned by and afraid of robots out of fear of hurting anybody ever again. Phase 6 might genuinely be one of my favorite chapters from the entirety of Robotics Notes because the chapter itself is effectively like a love letter to Astro Boy specifically, with the exact same message, that robots are humanity's friends. Fujita, for the longest time, firmly operated by this belief. After all, he was the final disciple of Dr. Jiro Aizawa, the real-life legend widely hailed as the father of toy robotics in Japan, who also happened to be a close collaborator and friend of Osamu Tezuka, the author of Astro Boy. Fujita even modeled and named his robots in honor of Dr. Jiro Aizawa. But the incident wherein Yoshiro-kun fell on Juna had completely changed everything for both Juna and Fujita. It gave Juna a decade-long fear of anything to do with robots or her grandfather, and it gave Fujita even greater wounds to his heart. An immense guilt that entirely flipped over his ideology of robots being humankind's friends. After the accident, Fujita started believing that humans and robots should forever be completely segregated, and that children, especially, should never go anywhere near them. In the end, the fundamental contention of this chapter is between whether robots are just a bunch of worthless programmed artificial pieces of junk, or if they have meaning to them and can be legitimately regarded as friends of humanity. Both Juna and Fujita lean towards the former of the two standpoints for the majority of this chapter, with the ways their traumas had tremendously influenced the way they viewed robots. For Juna, there are three turning points that truly make her change her mind. First is Kaito showing her a photo of herself, her grandfather, and Yoshiro-kun all together and all smiling, as if Yoshiro-kun gave them the greatest joy in the world. The second of these turning points was rewatching the recording of Gunbuild 1's public demo, where she was able to witness the reactions of everyone present for the event and see for herself how so many people, children, adults, and the elderly alike, found value, meaning, and excitement by the proposition of a moving giant robot. Not a soul among them was afraid of Gunbuild 1 the way that Juna was. Rather, they were inspired by it, motivated to attend out of awe. It was here that Juna understood Fujita's original ideology. Artificial though they may be, robots are indeed the friends of humanity. And on top of that, the idea that this single giant robot was the culmination of so many different people's efforts and dreams over the course of a decade, her grandfather's included, moved her to tears, especially when she figured out that she indirectly ended her grandfather's dream and destroyed her grandfather's ideology. The final piece of motivation for Juna was learning from her father how Fujita's side of the accident had went down, with Fujita forever blaming himself for the accident rather than Juna. At this point, Juna felt compelled to do something to lift up her grandfather's spirits and reinstill his robot-loving ideology, as if she alone had the power to change things, as if she was the master of her fate and the captain of her soul. And Junna's actions here were, in turn, what was the turning point for Fujita. Seeing Junna and the Robotics Club recreate the Robot Clinic's appearance from when it first opened decades prior completely overturned his newfound beliefs that robots and humans should be segregated. After all, his storage robots were freely interacting with the public, and not a soul other than himself was afraid. Not children, not adults, and not Junna. The icing on the cake was Junna and Fujita reconciling after all this time, both now with the same firm conviction about the meaning of robots. Phase 6 is, all in all, a beautiful chapter, and more than anything, an incredible love letter to Astro Boy and its central message: robots are humanity's friends. But you know, the connections between Astro Boy and Robotics Notes don't end here. However, to discuss those, I will need to bring up context from the rest of the SciADV franchise, so this final section of this video contains spoilers for the entire Science Adventure series up to and including Anonymous Code. Robots were created to be friends with humans. I spoke earlier about that central line from both Astro Boy and Robotics Notes Phase 6, but there was another meaning to it that I didn't quite get the chance to mention. In the context of Astro Boy, this line is often used as a response to when certain characters claim that robots were created to serve humans, or that robots are inferior to humans, or that robots were created to be slaves to humans with no real free will. So the idea that robots are humanity's friends is really supposed to be the idea that robots, humans, and even all sorts of different alien species are equal to one another. And more than that, it's also coming from the standpoint of artificial existences all having souls and also their own free will, the same way that humans do. After all, you are the master of your fate, the captain of your soul. When you look at it from that perspective, you realize that at their cores, Astro Boy and SciADV fundamentally both argue the same exact thing: that artificial existences are just as real or legitimate as physical or biological ones. In the case of Astro Boy, this is done from the standpoint of saying that sentient robots are just as legitimate as humans. And in the case of SciADV, this is done from the standpoint of arguing that AIs are just as legitimate as real people, and that even if we existed in a simulation, that wouldn't diminish the value of our own lives. That is to say, if our world were to be fundamentally digital, that still would not make our existences meaningless, if that's what we so choose to believe. The way that Robotics Notes specifically depicts the likes of Irie and Sister Centipede as so legitimate as well is further testament to that idea. They're no different from one another, hence why they are able to exchange memories, since Gaia recognizes them as one and the same. But let's put the AI existences aside from now. What are robots supposed to represent? In a series about existentialism and the meaning of artificial existences, what is the significance of having an entry that focuses so heavily and so intently on robots? And the question sort of gives away the answer here. Robots themselves are artificial existences. They may not be sentient the way that the AIs we see are, but they are still artificial, and they carry meaning for people nonetheless. Intriguingly enough, there's even a moment in Phase 6 where Kaito describes Yoshiro-kun as seeming to have a will of its own despite being a robot. It's so interesting to look back at Robotics Notes with the understanding that the robots themselves are an allegory to everybody in the series being a programmed artificial existence, and also the essential message of the series in that none of that matters. The robots carry so much sentimental value for people, despite not being real. But anyways, that just about wraps it up for this video. If you caught any more connections between the two stories, please let me know in the comment section. Special thanks to Tezuka and Fasti for their help in the making of this video and its corresponding article. In the meantime, Nochio!